Welcome to the Dyson Leadership Podcast. Today on the podcast, we are going to be featuring an interview with Earl Morrison. Earl is a 29-year veteran of law enforcement. He is a retired chief of police and former assistant director of the Council on Law Enforcement Education and Training. Now he owns his own business. He is doing leadership training consulting and is working with other organizations to grow and develop their leadership. Earl is a wealth of information, is an author, leadership speaker, trainer, law enforcement professional. He's got a great resume and background, a ton of experience to share with you. So I'm looking forward to having him on. So let's jump into this and let's get to Earl's interview. Hello and welcome to the Dyson Leadership Podcast. My name is Nick Dyson, your host, and I'm joined today by Earl Morrison. And we're going to be talking about his leadership journey and some of the work that he's doing with leadership training, leadership teaching, some different things about him and his background. So I really am excited to have Earl on. We've been able to connect and chat for a little bit and talk about some of the impact that leaders can have. And I hope this podcast is going to add value to you. That's the goal for this podcast. We add value to leaders so that you can then go out, lead in your community, your business, your organization. And the tagline, the motto of my business, we're here to unlock your leadership. Earl, it is great to have you on.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Yeah. So Earl, let's get started with some background for our audience. Tell me a little bit about yourself, your work, your business, and what you're currently doing.
Sure. So I actually recently retired from law enforcement after almost 29 years. Over the last tomorrow will be 7 years since we started our business, Leading and Learning with Character. And that was kind of birthed out of when I became a chief of police, which was one of my ultimate goals in the policing world. Politics came into play, things that we don't always know about, the behind the scenes leadership stuff that we don't always talk about. I found myself out of that job after about 2.5 years. And so during that, it was like, that's not what we talked about. Nobody said anything about what happens when politics kick in, what happens when, you've heard the term the good old boys and girls, what happens when all that kicks in and then you find yourself in an area where you didn't expect to be. And so what I was trying to do was figure out how am I supposed to learn from my situation, and then how can I help someone else learn from it when we don't talk about the difficult things and we don't really talk about the behind the scenes stuff. And so from that, I wrote my first book, Leadership Lessons Learned, because again, it was a moment for me to try to learn, but then I was like, how can I help someone else that may fall into the same category, that doesn't know where to turn, that doesn't understand what's going on in things that's difficult for us to talk about. And so after we wrote that first book, it was the thought of, okay, now how do I get this out there more? If people don't see the book, if they don't read the book, then how can I put these difficult things and struggles out there to help the next person that may be in my position? And so that's when we actually started the business, and I started creating some leadership topics, training and teaching courses, and some other things from that.
Sure. Tell me a little bit more about the book specifically. Some leadership lessons learned. What are some key leadership lessons learned coming from your years as a law enforcement person in law enforcement? What's some of the key lessons that you include in that book?
So some of those are, you got to have a strong foundation. Part of that is, while I have a strong foundation, faith-based belief in God, that He's in control, not everybody understands that, but you still have to have a strong foundation, because if you don't, you're going to be swayed easily one way or the other. The other one is learning from your mistakes. It's one of the most difficult things for leaders to realize, is that if I want to lead well, I have to learn well, and I have to learn from my mistakes. And the only way to do that is you got to admit them. And I talk about making good decisions. We get caught up in the right or wrong. Am I right or you are right? Or, we go back and forth. And I relate this most closely with a marriage. It's never about being right or wrong, because you're going to lose no matter what. It's always about making good decisions. I mean, even if you're right, or you got to get that moment where, okay, I could say that I am, you still lose because it's not about your desired outcome. And what's your desired outcome? That's where your focus has to be. So we talk about making good decisions. We talk about accountability, which is one of those things that people say they want it until you hold them accountable. And then I don't want it nearly as much. Then I'm like, I meant change their behavior, but not mine. Other things, teamwork, communication and the lack thereof. We talk about our conversations, and as a leader, as you move up in an organization, you really don't have idle conversations because everybody's listening and everybody's trying to find a connection. And so when you're trying to find that connection, things that you say that you mean a certain way, somebody else may pick up on it different. And so just some of those struggles, we talk about leading through challenges. 10 months in, we lost an officer in the line of duty. It brought about good things, but it also brought about, people's bad intentions. And so just talking about some of those things and the things that I learned. And then ultimately at the end of the book, we talk about staying well or leaving well. You're going to stay and be part of the solution, or you're going to leave and be part of the solution. And honestly, sometimes you leaving a situation is the solution. That's hard for us to grasp, because, I'm committed, I'm invested, but sometimes when you take that step back, you're like, you know what, even though maybe you didn't have anything negative that you were putting out there, maybe it really took you walking away for someone or something else to fall into place in order to move things forward for the solution. And so that's kind of what we do in that book is talk about those things and walk through it.
Yeah, that's great. And there's so much I could dive into and kind of go in just based on those topics. Just this morning, I was actually in a leadership class, and one of our topics that we covered was one of the first things you mentioned there, which was character and having a character foundation. And we went through some exercises and talking through that because the comparison that I give them in the class is kind of a mental picture. But you think about a house and the foundation of a house. That if the foundation isn't good, it doesn't matter how pretty the house is, all the renovations you put into it, the paint, none of that matters if the foundation's bad. And so it's the same for a leader and a person, that if their foundation, their character is not up to par, they're not embracing good values and seeking to add value to people, there's some holes in their character that it doesn't matter how much they have on their resume or how much experience they have. If they're lacking that character, then there's holes in their foundation and it's going to cause problems. So that's a great one. Another one that's really interesting. I've heard it a couple times in some leadership stuff that I've studied. Actually more in the business world specifically. Something else I failed to mention earlier about me, but I'm actually an adjunct business instructor. So I teach some business classes. And so one of the things you mentioned, and it's something that I try to encourage college students, if there's an instance to kind of add it as a mentoring aspect, is the thought of leaving well. And it's something that was ingrained in me in a situation that you don't burn bridges, that if you are trying to truly build people, keep a reputation, you need to try to maintain some relationships and those connections, because if you build bridges and burn those connections, you're not leaving well. If employers seek out to past employers and they're like, this person left, horribly angry, they destroyed stuff when they left, then there's no way you're getting a job in the future. So the importance of living your life in a way that it truly represents your character, your values, who you are. And that truly is something that is impactful for leaders. As far as,
sorry,
please go ahead.
Well, something you just said, one of the other topics we talk about is never compromise your character. And so it ties into that whole thing is that, if I leave poorly, it says more about me than it does any experience that I had in an organization. I don't care what organization you're in. I don't care the people that you deal with. When I react to, when I leave poorly, when I tear people down and I burn the bridges, it says way more about my character than anything that you've ever gone through. And so that's the other reason that we talk about those. I'm glad that other business entities and people are talking about that, because I don't think, we put enough emphasis on that leaving well as we're growing up and we're teaching our students from a very young age, and they go out into the workforce, is that, it doesn't matter if you're unhappy or not. You've got to deal with that because that's the way we're wired. And you can't burn bridges because you never know who you're going to encounter again somewhere else doing something else that may be totally unrelated, but they remember how you left. They remember how you did those things, and they remember how you were when you were there. And that's key. Again, thank you for bringing that up. I just wanted to touch on that just for a minute.
Sure. And just a couple practical things, because I even think back to me, that was something my parents specifically taught me growing up, is leaving well. And so that's even something a lot of times I don't feel like the business world or leadership focus deals with it as much as we really should. I definitely think that's a topic we could deal with more. And I think of something my parents taught me in that instance, and a couple of things that I've done. Even when I left a part-time job that I was working when I was in college, I wrote it was very short, but I still wrote a resignation letter thanking them for the opportunity for being there, just because it was a nice thing to do and a nice touch, because they had given me an opportunity and I was going on. And I remember even one of my previous employers, it was kind of the same thing. I sent an email to a lot of my coworkers thanking them for the time working, the relationship we had while we were there. I wrote a resignation letter, but I communicated. I was remote, so I communicated virtually with my manager because I wanted things to be done well. And I remember a couple people even gave me the feedback when I was leaving that they were amazed at that point that somebody that was a young professional at that time had the knowledge and the emotional intelligence to craft something like that and to be able to leave in such a way, because it spoke volumes to the character of the person. That to me was encouraging, because that meant I was doing something well. But at the same time, that also told me how much of a gap that is in our teaching in leadership. And I know for me, I'm a leadership trainer. You do leadership training. And so many times I see what is being done poorly, and that encourages me to go and create content or create topics, because if it's being done poorly, we need to address it and try to help people improve.
Absolutely.
So from your perspective as well, we've talked about your book, but talking about your leadership training, I want to touch on that just a little bit more. What type of organizations do you typically partner with and work with in that?
So over the last several years, most of mine has been in law enforcement. Again, that was my world. What I have learned throughout that is that we've had different people that have come into those classes. And so the leadership aspect of what I teach goes across any entity that's out there, any organization, any business that you can think of. And so while we do target the law enforcement world because that's where my experience comes from, we're trying to open up the possibility of partnering with other people and doing those things. And kind of that's where we're at right now, is looking for partners of people just, to bring me in and either host where I can put on classes or bring me into their organization to do some of these classes to address some of these issues.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great. And I was expecting from your background, you probably do a lot heavily with law enforcement. So I'll ask you from your perspective, what are some of the key leadership challenges that are currently facing law enforcement? And this could be in your area. This could be kind of as the country as a whole that you're seeing. But what are some key things that you're seeing that's kind of pulling on the heartstrings that you want to go in and try to help improve in the law enforcement space?
So without a doubt, the media has a certain way of portraying law enforcement and in some ways first responders altogether. We get that negative connotation, and part of that is that unfortunately sometimes we play into it. Sometimes we have those bad apples that are here and there, and the reality of that is it's probably 1% or less of all the law enforcement officers that are out there in whatever entity that they're in that are the bad apples. Now, we do have some organizations that there's some toxic things going on. There's lack of accountability. There's lack of preparation. There's lack of mentoring. And so I tell you right now, the three biggest things that are affecting law enforcement is recruiting, retention, and succession planning. And all that plays into what's happening out in mainstream media. And so for me, going in there is trying to help them refocus. Mindset is everything. From your mindset comes your attitude. All that plays into everything. And when we have the attitude that we're better than everyone, that we don't make mistakes, that it doesn't matter, we're going to keep doing it a certain way, that sends a wrong connotation. And I've been part of that. I've been in organizations that were that way. I was that way early on before I kind of figured out to kind of get out of my own way. But those are things that are affecting how we do things, because again, there's not the same respect for law enforcement as there used to be. Now, again, some of that is a perception, but the reality is that we have to change that perception. We have to be better at training and teaching and growing and developing our own individuals as they come in, because, it's all about the environment and the culture that you create. And you can go across, and there's some organizations that everybody's like, man, that is a great culture, great environment. They take care of business. They care for their own. They care for their community. And then we can also find some of those that you're like, I don't know what they're doing. I don't know who they're out for, but it doesn't look like they're doing the way that they're supposed to. And so how do you recruit better? Well, you change your culture and your environment. How do you retain people? You teach them the right way. You mentor them to do it the way that it should be done. And how do you make sure that we go into the future? Well, you succession plan. You train the people that are there to do the job of the people that are leaving. And I don't know why we get so caught up in not doing that, but it affects the whole mindset and culture of our organizations where, right now, that's an issue that a lot of organizations are having, is that now more than ever, people are leaving this business because they don't want to deal with the politics. They don't want to deal with the mainstream media. They don't want to deal with all the negativity because we've just allowed it to go for way too long. And at the end of the day, not just for police, but for the people out there, there's no accountability. They're all over the place. And so that's a hard thing, because now you're trying to recruit and you're losing your long-term people that used to stay 25, 30, 40 years. Well, people are hitting that magic number usually around 20, and they're leaving today. And that's a struggle that I think across the board law enforcement is having.
I could agree. So part of my background is in human resources, and specifically in higher education. And the college that I've worked at has a law enforcement program. And I know even their most class of graduates, and this was you could even include firefighters, law enforcement, and like nursing, health related programs. Every single one of the graduates had a job immediately upon graduating, because there is far more jobs open and the need for people in those spaces than what there are students actually going through the programs and entering that career field. So I definitely see it all around, from higher education to human resources. That's a huge issue that we're facing. You touched a little bit on succession planning, and I want to circle back to that. You made the comment about teaching people to take the jobs that we're currently in. The way I've always heard it phrased in leadership training is a leader should work themselves out of a job, which is a mindset that a lot of people struggle with. Is they don't want to give up that position. They don't want to give up what I've got control over in my leadership role. I don't want to bring somebody in to take over my role. There's even a funny story I heard one time of a CEO. I don't know if it's a true story or not, but it was kind of a joke that an executive asked their assistant to go and look and find the most capable person in their entire organization that could take their job, and then fire them because they didn't want competition around. And sadly, I feel like that's the reality of a lot of leaders, is they have this mindset of, I've got to protect what's mine. I've got to protect my position, protect my authority. And we don't engage and train and develop the people that are coming up through the ranks. And it's like you mentioned, for law enforcement, what does that look like? 10 years, 15 years? And when are you going to need that next wave of leaders? You can't wait until it's time to start developing them. You've got to start just right away. Get people built up and ready, and make sure that culture is growing to keep people engaged and wanting to work for you. It's even a statement, and I'll let you kind of answer and jump in after this, but I've even heard the statement many times in business that people don't quit jobs, they quit bad leaders. And that's something I definitely see. And I kind of hear it when you're talking about culture as well, that's a concern. You got to have good leaders and good leadership to be able to build a successful organization.
Yeah, for sure. And, It is. It's funny because we grapple about the fact that, people aren't taking over. We don't have anybody to fill these roles. And I grew up in an organization that was how it was related. Is that, and I wanted to know about everything around me. I wanted to be able to do that job. I wanted to be able to help my supervisors as much as the people around me. And I come from a military background. And so, I always go back when I'm teaching and tell everybody, one of the things that I can tell you that the military does well is they train the people around them to do everyone's job. The person above you, the person below you, the person beside you. At least they did a really good job of that when I was in. And I think they still do to some degree. But the problem comes is that everybody thinks because I want to know and understand what you do that I'm out to get your job. And I had to explain one time to one of my lieutenants when I was a sergeant is that, you know what, at some point I would like to do that job. I would like to have that job, but I can't take that job when you're there. But if I know how to do that, I can help you be better and I can help me be better. And so when I look at it, it's like the legacy I want to leave is that I helped somebody be the best that they could be, and I trained them to take over for when I wasn't there. Because regardless of how you leave, whether you get fired, whether you get resignated, that's when you're asked to resign, but you didn't know it was coming, or you retire or whatever, you just leave because it's time, you got another job. If I've done things the way that I should have, I have prepared those people to pick up the pieces and move forward because they're going to anyway. But if I've taught them, that's my legacy. That's my character that I've left behind. And I think we miss that so many times is that we think that because someone's going to know how to do their job that they may replace us. Well, if that's the case, then that means that you're not doing your job the way that you should if they're going to replace you with that person. Now, there may be lots of reasons that happens, but what I'm saying is that if we want to get better, if we want to have better culture and environment in our organizations, we've got to begin that succession planning, just like you said. We recognize talent the minute it walks in the door. Well, you can't do that if you're not being intentional and being disciplined about it. That's why I'm a huge proponent of mentoring programs, because you're seeing different pieces of that. You're teaching them the role, you're teaching them the job, you're allowing them to understand, you're allowing them to grow in the organization. But you're also looking at, okay, this person has potential for, and you're watching them, and now you're helping them develop. And see, in doing all that, you're also adding value. So if I'm adding value, especially today, if I'm adding value, you're more apt to stay than if I'm devaluing. And unfortunately, we get so caught up in these things that we devalue. Because if I'm a young person coming into an organization, and I know, I have a mindset that I want to succeed and I want to move up in that organization. Well, obviously, I can't come in thinking I'm going to be the executive director of something right away. But if I sit back and learn and understand, and then someone's helping me do that, I'm way more apt to stay because now there's value there. If I don't find value, especially today's recruit, they're going to go find value somewhere else. And so we've got to stop with that ego, and that's our problem, is the ego gets in the way. We've got to let go of that ego and say, you know what? If this organization is going to be the best that it possibly can be, then I've got to teach and train every single person to succeed and to be in succession line for the next promotion, the next step, whatever that looks like, even when I'm not there. It goes back to that character piece, is that's my legacy. If I can walk away, no matter how I had to walk away, and say that at least I prepared them and they're better prepared today, the organization and the individuals, then my legacy's intact.
Yeah, that is all great stuff. And even one thing you touched on, I just want to kind of echo and reinforce it, is I've seen so many studies and business journals that are looking at the idea of succession planning, training development plans, and how it relates to recruitment and retention. And what they're finding is that organizations that offer training and development and a clear succession plan that people can see, or even if it's not outlined that you can go up and promote these, but they're seeing people be promoted up and that it's visible to them that people are advancing within that organization, they are far more likely to stay and work for that organization. If it's an organization where they don't see any path forward, they're not seeing people get promoted, they don't really feel like there's going to be an opportunity for them to lead if that's their passion or something they're interested in, then they're going to go find it elsewhere. And that's something that's a challenge in the modern business world, is especially among younger workers. This is very much more common among millennials and Gen Z that are in the workforce now, and they're going to be the majority of the workforce in just a matter of a few more years. And they are the ones that are looking for, how can I grow? How can I develop? What can you teach me? And how can I advance? And if they're not seeing that, they become more and more disengaged. So that's definitely a problem we're facing. So Earl, as we are coming closer to the end of our time here on the podcast, I've got a couple more things just to toss out for you and see. I want to ask you, what is maybe one or a couple books that you've read, leadership books, that have really impacted your life? Something that's really been stand out for you?
Well, I'm a big fan of John Maxwell. And I know that, there's a lot of people out there that'll say that, he kind of repeats himself. And sometimes he does, but it's really good. I started out with the 21 indisputable characteristics of a leader. I used to take that book and walk my supervisors through that book. We'd each take a characteristic and we'd talk about it and teach the other group. And so that's one of them. I've read Good to Great. Again, I'm a John Maxwell fan, but trying to think of the names right away. Most of his stuff is really good and on point. You can't go wrong with it. I also like the Mentor Leader from, trying to think of the other one. Another one that I did, it's not necessarily a leadership book, but kind of is. It's Emotional Intelligence by Dr. Kevin Gilmartin. It's geared toward the first responder world, but let me tell you, that is a book that has changed a lot of perspectives, and I always push that when I teach, especially for the law enforcement, because of the things that we see and the things that we do, we kind of get caught up into that, and I think it can happen in any profession. It just happens in ours because we see things that a lot of people don't see in the first responder world. And so those are the some of the main ones. Again, sometimes, when you're thinking of titles, they don't come right away. But I can tell you right now, just about anything you pick up from John Maxwell is not going to be bad.
Yeah, I think every single book that you mentioned, I've got on the bookshelf behind me. So I can recommend those as well. They're great reads. Definitely an avid reader. For me, I'm always looking for new books, and it's always great to see people kind of reading and hearing some of the same books. So another question I'll have, earlier in the episode, you talked about, you primarily have worked a lot with police, and that's kind of the main focus of your business, but you're looking to branch out. So what are some people that you would see as your target audience, some people that you would like to work with in the future and provide leadership training? Who would those people be?
Honestly, Nick, it's really anybody that is you don't even have to be in a supervisory position, but you strive to be in a supervisory position. It can be you're there. You've been a brand new, supervisor. You've been a supervisor for a long time. You're an executive. It really doesn't matter where you're at, because what I would like to see is many more executives take that step to set an example, because that's one of the things that I hear in my classes a lot. I have the rank and file. I have the middle. I've had some close to the top. But sometimes the ego, and I'll say it, I know people don't like to hear it, but sometimes the ego gets in the way, and we think because we've made it to a position and we have a title that we don't still need to develop. The good ones know it, and they keep doing it. But I would say that those executives need to start setting the example, because when it comes from the top down and they see it, then they're not striving or trying to push something upward and feel like they're hitting a wall and a barrier all the time. So honestly, I know it sounds broad, but anybody that falls into that category honestly can connect with what I have.
Absolutely. And I don't disagree with your perspective, because even with my business, my training that I do in the area that I operate, that's a lot of my same focus. People ask me similar questions, and I'll tell them, anybody who is willing to learn. Because if you're not willing to learn, you're not going to listen to anything that I have to say. But if you're willing to learn and you want to take it to add value for yourself, your career, your family, whatever it is to build you up as a person, then I will work with you. But you've got to be willing to learn. All
Yeah,
right.
and they got to be willing to put the effort in, and that's what I tell people. It's all about the effort.
Absolutely.
I can give you a roadmap, but I can't make you follow it.
Absolutely.
But if you do, and you put forth the effort, I promise you'll see a positive change.
All right. So, Earl, last thing for my listeners here on the podcast, tell my listeners how they can find you, find out more about you. Maybe they want to go and find your book. I can list those links, that information down in the description on the podcast video, but also want to give you a chance to kind of insert your information here as well.
Sure. So we do have our own website at earlmorrison.com. You can email me at earl@earlmorrison.com. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on Facebook. I'm also on Instagram. I actually have 3 books. That Leadership Lessons Learned is the first one. Then I have a Mentoring for Life, and my most recent one that we published just this year is Jumpstart Your Leadership and Spiritual Growth. It's 119 days that takes you through, and it kind of takes you step by step through those leadership lessons and a few other that I've learned along the way. So, yeah, we'd be glad to hear from you. Love to connect, love to come out and teach anywhere out there. No limits for me.
Sounds great, Earl. Thank you for that. And like I said, for any of my podcast listeners, I will have these links from Earl and put those down in the description. So whether you're on YouTube, podcast, whatever, check out the description. You'll see those down there. And just want to take a minute and say, Earl, thank you for being on. This has been a great conversation, great podcast. I know where you're located, the work that you're doing, it is good work, and especially your focus in law enforcement, your law enforcement background. It's something that's needed, and I know it's adding value to a lot of people. So I definitely appreciate you taking the time to join me here on the podcast, and just want to thank you for that. So for the podcast listeners, be sure to check back next week for another episode of the Dyson Leadership Podcast. We put out new episodes every single week. So be sure to subscribe, follow along wherever you consume the podcast. Be sure to like, rate, share with whoever you think might find value in this. And I look forward to having you on for another episode next week.